conference, which was held in Westminster University. And those of you who were there on that day will remember it was incredibly hot. Temperature was in the high 80s, and I was chairing the very last session, which of course, always at these conferences there are a few hardy souls there, and which is a pity because there were some really good papers in that session. One of them was by Tim Turner, who I think comes from Melbourne, or Queensland University. And chatting afterwards, we said, wouldn't it be interesting next year to do a review of the previous 9 years? Now, this is one of these things that sounded like a great idea at the time. And then when I sent in the abstract, it said, oh, the conference is a long way away. And suddenly this thing turned into an awful lot more hard work than I had planned. And in fact, had I realized there was a research in progress stream in this, I might have put this in. Because in some ways, having done this exercise, I now know how to do it properly. But I think what I found in looking at all of this is quite interesting. So what I'd like to do is I would like to, just a brief introduction, then just talk about the 10 years of the conference, then talk about how I went about analysing all the various papers that have been given over the last 9 years, and then some findings, not all of them because I've had a chance to analyse all of the data yet, and some reflections with which to conclude. So let's talk about the background. Let's not talk about meta research. I've always regarded meta research, which is research about research, as being a little bit lazy. It means I just don't, we all do it of course when we do a literature review, but sort of researching other people's research means I can do it from my desk, which is really quite interesting. Really quite effortless in some ways. Other people have done all the hard work. I just piggyback on what they've done. But I think it can be very useful. And there have been a number of previous studies of e-government publications. Aki Gronlund did two. One in 2004 when we looked at Hicks Hawaii conference, this conference, and the eGov conference in DEXA. And then he did another one. We didn't have our conference in that one, so we just did Hicks and the DEXA conference in 2006. Don Norris and Lloyd did a study in 2006, and Kim Weiberg-Anderson and Helly Hendrickson did a study of papers on e-government in 2006, and Jochen Scholl has done a study which is not yet published on contributions to the e-government literature, looking at the major authors. So there's plenty of stuff out there that has already been done. I wasn't starting from scratch. So let me start with just some statistics. There have been 544 papers in the first 9 years. I haven't included this year. I do have it on the later slide. Of those, 538 are actually on e-government, which those of you who can do the arithmetic know there are 6 that are not. And I know what some of those 6 are. I can't remember all 6 of them, but I certainly know some of them. We want to ask how they got in there. That's something that we'll leave the conference organisers to explain later on over lunch. 190 of them single author, 211 dual author, and about 80%, slightly over 80% of them have been academic, and about 18% of them have been practitioner papers. I'll break that down a little bit further, but that gives you some sort of initial sense. So let me talk about 10 years of ECG. Here's the photographs. It started in Trinity in 2001, the 2002 St. Catherine's College, Oxford, then back to Trinity in 2003. 2004 was the Irish EU presidency, so we moved to Dublin Castle, which is, of course, the home of the Revenue Commissioners as well. We moved to the beautiful surroundings of Antwerp in 2005 and 2006. That's Marburg, that's Philipps University in Marburg, the oldest university in Germany, I think. The thing that looks something like from the Starship Enterprise is the high school, the Hof School in The Hague in 2007. We moved to Switzerland, to EPFL in 2008, last year in Westminster, of course this year in Limerick. So that shows the progress of where we were. And if we actually look at the papers, what's interesting about this is we started with 46, which is not bad for a first conference. The low point was the following year at St. Catherine's, we only got 37. But things picked up again in 2003. Dublin Castle is the biggest so far. Because that actually coincided with the launch of what then became separately the M-Government Conference with Ibrahim Kirshu launched that there. And over the years it's gone up and down. The last 2 years we've had particularly high numbers. The figure of 80 is depending on what you count, because this year we've actually had presentations without papers, so I'm not sure that those should be in there. What's interesting is if you look at the nationalities, there was a jump the first 3 years there were a relatively small representation, and then suddenly it jumped to 27. By the European, I suppose the European conference pulled in a lot of people, and then it leapt again in London, which says to me that actual location and being combined with another event attracts people in, and once they come in, they tend to stay. So once more people came in from countries further abroad, like Turkey and the Middle East and America, they tend to come back. So those are quite interesting. And as you see, the number percentage academic has varied a bit, but has tended to oscillate around the figure of 80. So those are just some numbers. Let me talk about the methodology of analysing all of these papers. This is what I lent myself in for. That's the pile, carefully disguising the chaos that is the rest of my office on Monday. Those of you with good eyesight will notice that I've had to cheat a little bit because I'm actually missing one of the paper sets from 1994. I only have that on CD. So to make the pile look right, I shoved in the 4th International Conference on E-Government so that I'd have a pile of 10. It is a lot of reading for my aging eyesight, I can tell you. I used a mixture of reading. Some of them, the early ones were only in paper form. I can't remember which year it started coming out in CD. Certainly in 1994 onwards has been available as CD, and that's a much easier medium to work with when you're doing this kind of research. The problem is with this. Now, I did have guidelines. I did have the work that Ronald had done, and I had his framework for analysis. And I largely started from that. But the difficulty is you start on page 1 of 2001, and you start categorizing papers. And you get about as far as 1994, and you realize this actually isn't working terribly well. I can improve it. So you change the way you do it, and then you go on from there, and then you've got to go back to the beginning again and reclassify. And really, I felt at the end at least 3 passes were necessary to get this right, possibly 4. And I only had time for 2, or we only had time for 2, because we were at this stage. Charles was ringing me up and saying, or Julie was ringing up and saying, where is this wretched paper? So I didn't have time to go through as many as I would have liked to. The general classifications were relatively straightforward. For example, the country of the lead author, the number of authors, the types of author, I categorized them into purely academic authors, so all the authors were associated with an institute of higher education, institute or university, practitioner authors only, research institute authors only, not many of those, are papers that were mixed, and so that was relatively straightforward. I then, and I'll talk about these two in a minute, I divided them into types and subtypes. I'll come back to subject later because it's a different point. And whether they use primary data or secondary data, simply yes or no. In some cases it wasn't always obvious whether they had, and there had to be a certain amount of guesswork that went into that. The primary problem was with types. In the end, I came up with this, and these are not quite the same ones that Brundtland uses, but they're not that far away. Papers that were based on case, whether Brundtland just distinguished between single and multiple cases. I didn't do that. Papers that I describe as conceptual, and that's something typically that has the word framework in it at some point in the title or the keywords. Incidentally, I didn't use keywords for 2 reasons, one of which was that not all the conferences actually had keywords in the paper. Methodological ones, which were ones which looked at methodological research issues in e-government. Investigative ones were ones where people actually went out and gathered data specifically in a very formalized way, as opposed to just maybe describing a case or whatever. Theoretical ones were ones which, as the name suggests, theory, and technical were papers which typically contained computer code or XML or something like that, which were very technical behind the scenes, discussing the mechanics of some program or interoperability or something of that type. I then decided that that really wasn't quite refined enough, so I had a number of subcategorizations, which I had descriptive, discussion, analytic, and conceptual. So I ended up with a framework. I'm sorry, this is not easy to read this, but it is in the proceedings. I ended up with a framework of 4x5 and 20 possibilities. Some of these either didn't exist or didn't have meaning. For example, down in the bottom left-hand corner, a conceptual stroke theoretical paper was one which is purely theoretical and discusses abstract concepts. In the top left, a case description is one which simply describes an application or a system. So I found that these worked reasonably well. When I redo this, if I ever get the courage to redo it, I'll refine this somewhat, but it's not a bad framework. It helps